Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern, and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. In this week's parsha Vayelech, the life of Moses is coming to an end, and so is our year. Moses provides his last instructions. So join us as we draw lessons for the new year ahead. Free at last. Well, the year is growing to an end, and I have come to be a firm believer that somehow the parsha always relates to what we're going through. And this week is definitely no exception. But before we begin, as you all know, Madlik is a podcast, and we are published on all of the popular platforms, Apple and all of the other podcasting platforms. And I always say, if you like what you hear, share it, give us a star, and give us a nice comment. And last week, we got an amazing comment from Chava. Chava wrote, "Dear Rabbi Mintz, dear Mr. Stern, I have never liked cooking and found Fridays somehow stressful until I discovered Madlik. I do listen to the late Rabbi Sachs's comments, and we still discuss them with great joy at the Shabbos table. I follow JTS Torah commentary and often cringe. But Fridays are now my Madlik days. Thank you much for this inspiring podcast. Shana Tova and Shabbat Shalom." And boy, did that warm my heart just to think, and I have heard this. There's a woman at my synagogue, Judy, who says that she also listens to the podcast religiously every week when she cooks for the Shabbat. And I came to my synagogue, the Conservative Synagogue of Westport, TCS, and I had switched the times that I was supposed to arrive, and I was about to apologize, and the lady who was in charge of the ticket says, "You don't have to apologize. I listen to the Madlik podcast." So we might not be famous, but when it counts, there are faithful people who listen to it, and that puts the pressure on us. We got to keep it up, I guess.
Fantastic. That's really nice. That note was so beautiful, and it's so nice that people listen to us and that we share a little bit of the parsha each and every week.
Agreed. And those of you who are listening, don't be shy. Give us a little support, So, as I said, we are in Parshat Vayelech. I think last week you said it was the shortest parsha. And as I said, it's really about the end of an era. And we'll see it's not only the end of Moses and the passing of the baton, but it also talks about exactly the moment that we are in right now, the end of the year, and to be very precise, the end of the Shmitah year, the 7th year. So that's the tease. Let's begin. Deuteronomy 31, verse 7 says, "Then Moses called Joshua and said to him in the sight of all Israel, 'Be strong and resolute, chazak ve'ematz, for it is you who shall go with this people into the land that God swore to their fathers to give them, and it is you who shall apportion it to them. And it is indeed God who will go before you. God will be with you and will not fail you or forsake you. Fear not and be not dismayed.'" Moses wrote down this teaching and gave it to the priests, sons of Levi, who carry the ark of God's covenant, and to all the elders of Israel. And Moses instructed them as follows. Every 7th year, the year set for remission, Shmitah, at the feasts of booths, Sukkot, when all Israel comes to appear before your God in the place that God will choose, you shall read this teaching aloud in the presence of all Israel. Gather the people, men, women, children, and the strangers in your communities, that they may hear and so learn to revere your God and to observe faithfully every word of his teaching. Their children, too, who have not had the experience, shall hear and learn to revere your God, as long as they live in the land that you are about to cross the Jordan to possess. End of literary point. It has that pay in asterisks. We know this is the end of a literary segment. So as I said, we start with God telling Moses it's going to be Joshua. And he says you just a few times. And Rashi picks up on this, and he says there can be but one leader for a generation, not two leaders for a generation, quoting Sanhedrin. And so really, we talked a few weeks ago when the queen died that it was long live the queen, God bless the king type of thing. You have that moment kind of here, and that recognition that there cannot be more than one leader.
Good. That is, it's so great because so many things that we've talked about revolve around the Queen dying and King Charles, and that was so smooth. There was nobody who said someone else should be the king, because everybody knew, right? That was the deal, that Charles was going to become the king. But when it came to Moshe, that wasn't so clear. It wasn't. Nobody knew who the next leader was going to be. If anything, you would probably have guessed that it would have been Moshe's sons, because Aaron, his sons, inherited the position of being the Kohen. So you probably would have thought that Moshe's sons would have inherited it. The moment that it's not Moshe's sons, it literally is up for grabs.
What I'm kind of struck by, reading it anew as I do every year, is this tight weaving between, on the one hand, Moses dying and passing the leadership on to Joshua. And as I said, in the same breath, it says at the end of every 7 years, the Shmitah year, you should go ahead and renew. You should go ahead and read publicly the Torah. And the rabbis and rabbinic Judaism in general really focuses on 3 words here, miketz sheva shanim, the end of the 7 years. So we just went through a Rosh Hashanah, and you would think that the end of the year would be on the 1st of Tishrei, the first day of Rosh Hashanah, and yesterday, which was the beginning of the new year, would be the beginning of the new year. But in fact, it's not quite as squeaky clean. The Rashi says this means in the first year of the new Shemitah year, in other words, the 8th year. So here we shall see that Yom Kippur, which comes 10 days after Rosh Hashanah, which we're going to celebrate next week, and even beyond that, the Sukkot holiday is part of this dance between the end of the year and the beginning of a new year. It's not quite so easy to make that transition. Am I putting too much into here, or is there a question? I mean, the Ibn Ezra goes ahead and said Techilat Hashanah. He's saying it's not the end of the year. It's, how they have at the end of these wedding videos where it says it's not the beginning or it's not the end.
It's not the end, it's the beginning, right?
It's the beginning. We have kind of that moment here.
So the point you made is an interesting point. And that is that we actually have a ritual at the end of Shmitah. That's kind of odd, because we don't usually have rituals at the end of holidays. Usually the ritual's at the beginning. Take Pesach for a minute. The ritual, the Seder, is at the beginning, right? It's not, the ritual's not wait till the end. But when it comes to Shmitah, the ritual is at the end, which is Hakel. Why is that exactly? Why don't we make the ritual at the beginning of Shmitah?
That's a great question. And the other part of it is that, we do have Havdalah. We make Havdalah at the end of Shabbat. So I think that might be the exception to the rule. Next week when we do Yom Kippur, we're going to make a big deal out of Kol Nidre, but we're also going to make a big deal out of Nila. But what strikes me is that the end really encroaches onto the beginning. It almost, reminds me of the custom to not make Havdalah, not end the Shabbat immediately at sunset, but to have that third meal, let that Malava Malka spill over into the new week and stretch out that taste. You have a little bit of that here because somehow there's this connection between not only the definitive end of Shmitah, which happens on the first of the year, but then we'll see in a second, Yom Kippur, which has a blast of a shofar, which becomes important for indentured servants. And then we have Sukkot, which becomes important because of this hakel, this gathering of all the people to hear the Torah once again. And then we even call the last day of Sukkot Atzeret, which means stop. It's finally an end to the end of the beginning, so to speak. But there is no question that it's unique here in the sense that it's a drawn-out ending, but not simply an ending that kind of peters out or fades out in a very slow and regulated fashion. You have these peaks. You have the shofar blowing on Yom Kippur. You have this hakel, this gathering, reading the Torah. I think it makes it kind of interesting in getting back to how we started about the end of Moses and the beginning of Joshua. I can't help but make the parallel to the end of an era and the beginning of a new one.
That's really good. I mean, and of course, this is the third to last parsha in the Torah, which is also actually the third to last chapter in the Torah. These last portions are very short. I'll just explain that for a second. It's a tangent, but it's an interesting tangent. Last week's portion, this week's portion, next week's portion, and they're all very, very short. The reason for that is because we kind of ran out of parshas, right? Means there aren't quite enough parshas for the cycle of the year, and we need to take it right till Simchat Torah. So we kind of shorten the portions in these last few weeks to make sure that we lead into Simchat Torah. So this is just 1 week. But that idea that this is the end and it's also the beginning, and how you define the end and the beginning. And it's the end of the Shmitah, but it's the beginning of Hakel. And it's the end of Moshe, but it's the beginning of Yehoshua. Is it the beginning or is it the end?
Yeah. And this word, the Rabbeinu Bachaya, one of the commentaries that I brings, he talks about this word miketz. And he gives instances where it literally does mean at the end. And there are other instances where it means after the end. But he quotes the first time that the verse is used in Genesis, and it says, God said to Noah, I have decided to put an end to all flesh. Kates kol basar. It's really, Kates is the ultimate end. It's mortality. And you really do, even in the choice of language and the references that the commentaries are making, somehow, and of course, we cannot help but feel it. The beautiful thing about the Jewish holidays is they are so linked to the change in season. And, the secular New Year is in the middle of the winter. You'd never have a Jewish holiday in the middle of something. It's always at, in a daily basis, you have Shabbat come at dusk. It ends when the sun sets. You have Passover Passover in the spring. You have the Rosh Hashanah at the end of the year, meaning the fall, where you get that sense of mortality. You get that sense of the end of the cycle of life. So I really do think, as you know, many times there are people that say that the three pilgrimage holidays, the Shalosh Regalim, it's almost one cycle. And then you have this Rosh Hashanah, which begins very non-characteristic of Jewish holidays on the first day of the month, as opposed to the middle of the month when the moon is bright. I think that somehow the Torah is actually mixing the two together in a very nuanced and a beautiful way, and you kind of make the transition from the first of Tishrei to Sukkot, which is one of those pilgrimage festivals. I just feel it for the first time reading these verses.
That's good. What do you make about the fact that Joshua pops up here again, even though we haven't heard from him in a long time?
Well, I mean, I do think, again, the emphasis is not on Joshua, but I think he almost becomes a foil. Joshua is the next one. And if anything, the Bible is emphasizing more the you in Joshua. We all have commented before that Deuteronomy is written in a different voice. But as Rashi picks up on, it says twice, you shall apportion it to them. You shall go with them. It's you, I think, to exclude Moses. It really is the fall, the winter of Moses' life. And there is it's all about transition here, which I find so fascinating.
And Hakel is transition, because that's how you transition back to the 6 normal years.
I think so. And you know, the last verse in this literary piece that we read is the ultimate transition. Not only do you gather the people, the men and the children, but their children too, who have not had the experience, shall hear and learn to revere your God as long as they live in the land. This is talking into the future as well. It's a kind of a gift of this transition, but it's definitely, it seems to me, to be a very profound sense of transitioning from generation to generation, from time, from life to death to life again, all at the same time in the midst of 7 odd verses.
I think that's right. I think that's great. I mean, and this is in this little chapter you have all about transition, and let's just talk for a minute. What do you think it was like for Moshe, this transition? I mean, this is an unfulfilled dream for Moshe. It's easy for us to say transition. What about if you're the one who doesn't go into the promised land?
Yeah, and of course we've discussed this before. You know, we quote Pirkei Avot that says it's not yours to finish, lo avodah lecha legmor, and all of that good stuff. No question, it is something that is a bittersweet moment for him, and I say bittersweet because a successful leader creates a new generation of leadership. And that has to be satisfying to him. It has to be satisfying to him that the God that, you know, worked with him was going to work with the generation ahead. So I do think if anything comes through in these verses, it's ambiguity. There's got to be this sense of continuity, and there's got to be this sense of disruption, of happiness and sadness, sweetness and bitterness. I
mean, I think that's right. And I think that, you know, that's really a nice way to look at it from your perspective, to say that Moshe, you know, this is a transition, and, you know, at least if I'm not going to do it, but the guy who's doing it is a good guy, right? Is someone who I trust.
Yeah. So what I'd like to do is get a little more tactile and really get a sense of what we're talking about, what happened. So the Mishnah in Sota describes that what happened was on the first day of Tabernacles, of the 8th year after the 7-year sabbatical, immediately after the closing of the 7th, a wooden stand would be erected in the sanctuary, whereupon the king would sit, and the officer of the congregation would take a holy scroll. We're talking about a scroll now. We're not talking about tablets. We talked when we started Deuteronomy that it was the scroll of Deuteronomy that was taken and discovered in one of the times that the temple was not destroyed but in ill repair and found. And it gives this amazing, talk about bittersweet story about a certain King Agrippa, who was, I believe, King Herod's grandson. And even
Right.
King Herod wasn't totally Jewish. So it says King Agrippa was accustomed to accept it while standing, and he would also read it while standing. And the rabbis praised him for this act. And when he would reach the passage in Deuteronomy 17:15, thou mayest not set over thee a stranger who is not thy brother, tears would roll down from his eyes. The rabbis then said, do not be afraid, King Agrippa. Thou art our brother, thou art our brother. Then he would read from the beginning of Deuteronomy up until chapter 6. So you even have this bittersweet moment of the king of that moment, who was a good king. You can look him up on Wikipedia. Fascinating story. He was a good friend of Caligula, but he did good by the Jews. And you have this moment of looking in the mirror when you read the ancient text and you get to evaluate how you stand up to it. But this literally would be happening in the next few weeks. We are literally at the end of the 7-year cycle. There are fields that are in Israel that have not been plowed or tended to for this past year. And now in this 8th year, we would be having this amazing a ceremony. So it really brings the moment of the Jewish calendar that we're in right now to a whole new light, I think.
It's great. I mean, it's by chance that we read this portion now, because, of course, the idea that we have Simchas Torah, we finish the Torah on, this time of year, is only, there were two traditions. There was an annual cycle, we finish it every year, and there was a triennial cycle, we finish it once every 3 years. In Israel, they had a triennial cycle. So they didn't get to this until once every 3 years. But the fact that now that we have that this week, and this is transition, because it doesn't talk about Yom Kippur, but let's just segue to Yom Kippur for a minute. If you want to know what the theme of Yom Kippur is, in a lot of ways it is transition. Just to share a little thought, and that is on Yom Kippur we say Yizkor. That's a funny thing to say on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is all about us, right? We ask for forgiveness and us and us and us, and we say we're sorry and all that kind of stuff. And all of a sudden we have Yizkor right in the middle. And the rabbis say that, in the Torah, the day is not called Yom Kippur. In the Torah, the day is called Yom HaKippurim in the plural. It says it's a day of forgiveness for the living and for those who have died already. In a way, Yom Kippur is a transition. It's a transition we're supposed to take everything we learned from our parents and we're supposed to transmit it to our generation and to the next generation. So this idea, and of course, like you said, transition is complicated and transition is hard, and we don't know what we don't know what we're supposed to transmit, and what we transmit, we don't know if we're doing such a good job. So transmission is hard, but transmission is the real thing. So I think that also is very relevant to what we're doing now.
Well, I love that you brought in Yom Kippur because that's exactly my next source, which is that there's the 7-year cycle, and then there's the 7 times 7-year cycle, which is the Jubilee, the Yoval. And it says on the Jubilee years, on the 10th of Tishrei, it says, thou shalt you cause the shofar to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. On Yom Kippur shall you sound the shofar. And the Gemara asks, in accordance with whose opinion is this? It is the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Ben Birkir, as it is taught. And you shall hallow the 50th year. Since it is stated that the shofar is blown in Yom Kippur, one might have thought that the year is sanctified only from Yom Kippur and onward. Therefore, the verse says, and you shall hallow the 50th year, which means that the year is sanctified from its beginning onward. Again, from the first of Tishrei, we have this ambiguity, ambivalence between the first or the last. But here's what's fascinating. Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Mocha, said, from Rosh Hashanah until Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year, Hebrew slaves were not released to their homes because the shofar had not been sounded. So we have one verse that says that the indentured servants go free on the first of Tishrei, but on the other hand, it says that you shall blow the shofar and shout freedom, the words that we have on the Liberty Bell. So it says, and they were also not enslaved to their masters. So you have these indentured slaves who are not neither here nor there. They are no longer slaves, yet they are not yet free. Rather, they would eat, drink, and rejoice, and they would wear their crowns on their heads like free people. For the whole 10 days, we call it the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, the indentured servants were feasting and drinking and rejoicing. Once Yom Kippur arrived, the court would sound the shofar, slaves would be released to their houses, and fields that they were sold would be returned to their original owner. So really, you talk about what Yom Kippur, what the 10 days of repentance mean to us, this image of slaves going through the transition, the process of becoming free, it gives, to me, my takeaway is that as we get rid of our sins, what we're really doing is possibly getting rid of our dependencies, getting rid of those things that do enslave us. And that shofar that blows, we're all, in a sense, kind of indentured servants who are being freed. But it really fits into the narrative of those people that rejoice at the end of Yom Kippur, that this is the most happiest day of the year. It really resounds to me.
It's such a striking Gemara because it really gives you the sense that you're in prison between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Me Rosh Hashanah ad Yom Kippurim lo hayu avadim niftarim levatehem v'lo mishtabdim ladoneihem ela ochli b'shosim usmechim atoteim b'roshem kevin shegi Yom Kippurim taku beitim b'shofar niftaru avadim levatehem v'sados chosrot livaleihem. Means they prepared for Yom Kippur, but but they weren't free yet. Isn't that a weird thing? They celebrated the fact that they knew that they were going to be freed.
Yeah. It provides a wonderful, you talk about different models, different metaphors, different ways of looking at what we're doing now. And I think to look at it from the ideas of these engendered slaves, servants, both from their eyes, from their master's eyes, it just becomes fascinating. And I could not but help notice that the word for them becoming free is niftaru. It's the same word that we talk about when somebody passes away, that he's niftar. And I talked about this in an earlier segment when we talked about this concept of tzrur b'tzrur hachayim. And I have to say that tonight's learning is dedicated to a cousin of mine, a pillar of the Jewish community, Sandy Gottesman, who passed away last night. And I think, and this is so his neshama can have an aliyah, but it's also very similar, and you can help us with this, Rabbi, that the time period between when somebody dies to when they're buried to the Shiva, to it's all these transitions. And the word for niftar, which can be released if you're an indentured servant, but also released from the shackles, the boundaries of the physical, is just fascinating to me.
It's fascinating. First of all, let me just say that that we're sorry about Sandy. He lived sometimes you say someone lived an amazing life, and he valued every second of that life, and he made a difference every second of that life. And that's a nice thing to say about somebody, something that, you don't say that about everybody. So we remember him as someone who made an unbelievable difference, right? In the Jewish world, in the New York world, in the Israel world, he just made a tremendous difference. And, Niftar, he is released to the world to come, but the transition, everything's about transition. We go from being onanim, where we don't daven, we don't put on tefillin, to being mourners, where we put on tefillin, but we sit on the floor. Then at the end of Shiva, the best transition ever, we walk around the block. And why do we walk around the block? Because, it's hard to go out after Shiva. Shiva is very comforting. People come to visit you. You don't have to go anywhere. It's hard to go out. So they force you to go outside because that's part of the transition. And I think that's right. It's all about transition. This is a week of transition. And the Torah portion really says in the Torah portion, I think the Torah portion, better than any of these things, highlights the fact that transitions are complicated. And I think that's really what you're supposed to remember around Yom Kippur, is the transitions are really complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can't think of these released slaves without also thinking, and we've talked about this verse before, about the slave who decides he wants to stay with his master. And the custom is that he gets taken to the doorpost and his ear is pierced with an awl. And the Talmud in Kedushin says, "The Holy One, blessed be he, said, this ear heard my voice on Mount Sinai when I said, for to me the children of Israel are slaves," which indicates that they should not be slaves to slaves. Ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim velo avadim la'avadim. And yet this man went and willingly acquired a master for himself. Therefore let his ear be pierced. So as we watch these slaves, and maybe as we put ourselves into the shoes of these slaves, even though we're not talking about Passover, but this radical sense of freedom when you, through the process of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Hakel, Sukkot, the end of Shmitah, realize that you are not a slave to any other slave. When you get rid of all those dependencies, that is true freedom. And it's so amazing to me that on the Liberty Bell is exactly this word, that you shall ring freedom throughout the land. As Americans, we can really get this too. But of course, we have to remember that it wasn't a bell. It was a shofar. And that's what I'll be thinking of on Yom Kippur.
And of course, that's why we blow shofar at the end of Yom Kippur, not because of the shofar of Rosh Hashanah, but because of the shofar of Yovel, of that transition from one thing to the next. So that really is the perfect conclusion to this whole discussion. And we wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. You should have a meaningful and an easy fast. And next week, we look forward, Thursday night, we will talk about Ha'azinu, the last poem in the Torah. Shabbat Shalom, Gemar Chatima Tova, and an easy fast, everybody. Be well.
Same to you, Rabbi. Same to all you listeners. Gemar Chatima Tova, a sweet, healthy, prosperous year. Let us all make all the transitions that we have to, and we'll see you all again next week. Shabbat Shalom.